Daniel Gillman with College.town here at the 2026 NCAA Convention in D.C., joined now by Chris Pietruszkiewicz, the president of the University of Evansville, D1 Board of Directors. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Good to be here.
Absolutely. I want to dive in to that board of directors hat, and then maybe we'll kind of go back and forth between you being a president and you being on that BOD. But, from the most part, throughout the week of conversations, what are some of the topics that have been top of mind for the BOD?
I think one of the things that's right off the top is the participation agreement. The House settlement happened a year ago, and we said we were going to do some more work to be able to govern ourselves. And this is one big way to do that. We've been asking Congress for help, completely 100% supportive of the SCORE Act. Right? We need areas in which Congress can only help us. But we have to do some more ourselves. And a part of that is that we have to agree that we're going to be willing to have enforcement actions. And we're going to have to be able to accept what the College Sports Commission or the NCAA says is the penalties for violating the rules. And first step is we've got to agree to that ourselves.
And in D1 Ticker, we saw a couple presidents come out in the last few days that have implored their peers to sign that CSC participation agreement. And as a president of an institution that has opted into the House settlement, how does that, change your viewpoint or make it so you have a more unique stance?
We've only been hearing about the negative part of the participation agreement, the reasons why you shouldn't sign it. So for the presidents, my fellow presidents from Oregon, or from Washington, from Arizona, from Georgia, and Virginia Tech, thank you. They did a big service to college sports, which is, now's a good time to be able to stand up and say, this is the right thing to do. And if you have a very simple motto, make the right decisions for the right reasons at the right time, the right decision for the right reason at the right time is signing the agreement.
And what is, the other opinion, at least in the room, for those that are not 100% on board?
Well, I think those that are not on board are largely coming from the penalty provisions, right? How is this going to affect me in the future, right? It's easy to say now, okay, so I'm willing to sign the agreement, but what happens if I violate a rule in the future, right? And I don't have the ability to appeal. I think we got to think about college sports bigger than the institution in which you represent. And I recognize as a university president that my first and foremost area of responsibility is protecting my institution and helping my institution advance. But at another level, you've got to think, if we're a member of Division I for the NCAA, we have a bigger responsibility. And a bigger responsibility is thinking, how do we eliminate some of the chaos that's happening in college sports? And this is one of the ways to do it.
You've also been outspoken about feeling the need to govern yourselves. And walk us through kind of what that looks like and what the other side is. What is it when you're not governing yourself? Who are the ones that are calling the shots?
So House settlement last year, right? A really big deal for the NCAA, right? We decide we're going to pay a whole bunch of back damages. Right? The result is that we say, if we do this, we can now have the ability to govern ourselves. And the difference is that right now you have a separate case in one state or another, an eligibility case in another state. And the theory is that it only affects one person. The impact is that it affects the whole country. So the ability to be able to have the SCORE Act, to be able to help us determine some eligibility issues, to be able to not have litigation govern the whole NCAA. And a big part of that was the House settlement was supposed to allow us to clear a lot of that stuff out, right? The next part is that we actually have to do it ourselves, and we have to have schools that are going to be willing to be governed by their own rules.
And with the SCORE Act, and let me know if this is something that is not quite on the table right now, but so much of the conversation with President Baker and some of the other key members of the NCAA have been about a potential collective bargaining agreement and how that might factor in. And as well, as a president of a school that has opted in to that House settlement with that $20.5 million number, watching these two, are they individually separate, the collective bargaining conversation, and seeing that number grow, or are they a bit tied together?
I think the collective bargaining, that's ultimately what happened as part of the House settlement, right? That was a collectively bargained result with class counsel, the NCAA, and the defendant conferences. But if you think about what the future looks like, I don't think they're necessarily tied together. Right? One of the things we should be doing as an organization is listening to our student athletes. And all of the student athletes, my 4 years on the board, all of the student athletes have said the same thing. and that is we don't want to be employees of a university. So it's one thing for a university president, it's another thing for the NCAA to say, right, we ought to think about this a little bit differently. But when you have 500,000 student athletes and they're all collectively saying we don't want this, right, I think we all ought to listen, including our representatives in Congress that hopefully will help us out with the SCORE Act.
And so as we kind of tip back towards that president role, in the last, we could even say 2 years, but I'd love to look at 5 years. How has your role changed in terms of your, I guess, connective tissue to the topics of those student athletes and kind of what they want?
Well, if you think about some of the guarantees that we all promised, right, post-eligibility health care, mental health needs for our students. I had breakfast with the student athletes this morning, and they all talked about mental health needs, right? It's not just our student athletes, it's all across our campuses, and we should be paying more attention to those types of issues. But if you think about, every time you pick up the D1 ticker, right, college sports is the front porch to our universities, right? It is how most of the people in the city of Evansville connect with us, right? We have 2,500 students, but we have 4,000 or 5,000 fans show up to every basketball game, whether we win or lose, right? That's the connective part that we have to our community, whether it's college basketball or making a run in baseball last year and being one game from the College World Series. As a university with 2,500 students, it means this big tent that we call the NCAA has been really successful.
I guess one more thing in terms of the change in the last decade has been a little bit more tied to the fundraising aspect of things, and talking to a couple different athletics directors over the last few days and seeing the difference between, an A4 school and a group school, but then sometimes those fundraising numbers are pretty similar. And where do you feel like that might change in the next couple years in terms of seeing this house settlement reach a point where some schools are at 18 million, but some schools can get up to 20?
Well, there's a lot of schools that can get up to 20.5.
Right.
We are not one of those. But I think we're the majority of those schools. We invest in our student athletes, but there's lots of ways that we support them other than with NIL dollars. And one of the things that I think has been really helpful is being able to bring the NIL dollars in-house as opposed to relying on third-party collectives, right? So that we have more of an opportunity to be able to talk with our student athletes. If you think about the role of university president, right, you're supposed to be in charge of the entire operation. And before bringing NIL in-house, that was the one that was carved out of what university presidents, athletic directors were not a part of. So bringing that back gives us a little more sense of stability within our athletic departments.
And having the background that you have as a tax attorney and trial lawyer, has that kind of come to the forefront here in the last 6 to 8 months with everyone asking you questions about the House and the Congress and everything like that?
Yeah, you take the background that you have, and it really does have an impact on the work that you do every day, whether it's college sports or otherwise. And the ability to be able to understand how litigation shapes the governance part, I think, has been helpful in the board of directors conversations. Right? Sometimes you have policy issues and you take business risks, right? So the lawyers can tell you these are the risks that are associated with it, and perhaps as a lawyer, you might be able to understand those risks a little bit better, but you still have to make business decisions. So the legal background helps in understanding and framing the argument. The business decision is really how do you move forward, and ways to be able to do that don't violate antitrust.
You talk about the conversations with the student athletes in the breakfast this morning, and I want to touch on that in a minute, but back to the mental health, and so much of our conversations have also revolved around how to regulate sports gambling and how we can try to find a way. Is that something that the board is ever presently discussing, or is that kind of in a different field, letting other people try to figure that out, like the NCAA office?
Well, I think sports gambling is a big part of this, and I think it's very much linked to mental health.
Yeah.
Right? If student athletes are being harassed online because of prop bets, then we ought not to have prop bets, right?
How do we get that done?
Well, that's what we've been telling everybody, right? If you listen to President Baker, right?
Yeah.
This is his soapbox, right? Which is prop bets really hurt, right? It's really easy to bet on an under.
Correct.
Right?
And then convince someone to
Yeah,
not do
and then
it.
convince someone to do that, right? You just saw the indictments that happened today, right? The result is, I'm not sure that they're all related to prop bets, But at the end of the day, it has to be an integrity of the game issue. And the NCAA is paying attention just as the U.S. Attorney's Office is.
It's been quite a day with the unsealing of the indictment that has led to nearly 20 D1 schools and almost 40 student athletes that have been involved in these fixing games. Walk me through what that looks like when you open your phone in the middle of the NCAA convention and you see a report like that. What are the conversations like today?
I think integrity of the game, we've got to make sure that we convince our fans all across the country that there is integrity in the game. And the good news is I think the monitoring is happening incredibly well by the NCAA. So it doesn't matter whether it's an A4 school or a mid-major school or a low-major school, right? They're monitoring all of those types of activities. They're monitoring betting lines. And so you not only have the federal authorities taking a look at it, but the NCAA is doing its job also.
Is it something that the board is not necessarily surprised to see, or did this kind of come out of the blue in terms of the indictment unsealed today?
Yeah, I think you talk to the NCAA about that and the conversations they have back and forth with the federal authorities. That's not something that the board of directors is really operational on. We have a fantastic staff led by John Duncan, and they have conversations with people to make sure that there's integrity from not only the NCAA's perspective, but making sure our fans understand that there's integrity of the game also.
All right, let's go back to that breakfast this morning. You mentioned mental health was the number one point of concern. What were some of the other things that student athletes were talking to you about?
Well, I think they really like the fact that there's a student athlete voice that continues to grow within the NCAA and the NCAA boardroom. Right? If you think about the successes, just think about the success of the basketball tournament. It's because of student athletes. And the idea that our student athletes have more of a voice in governing themselves, I think is incredibly helpful. And the student athletes that I talk to are appreciative of the fact that not only are they having conversations in the boardrooms, but they're also having conversations with their conferences, and they're having conversations with their athletic departments, so that the views of the student athletes become even more important. And importantly, they're willing to talk about mental health. You know, if you think about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that's not something that my generation was willing to talk about. But the fact that student athletes are willing to do that, not only have a conversation with academic advisors, with career counselors, but with our mental health counselors on campus, well-being should be at the top of the list. And I think that continues to grow with our student athletes.
And so you mentioned the basketball tournament, so I've got to ask, from a president of a school like Evansville, what does it look like to potentially expand the tournament field to add a little bit more of the group of 5 or 6 schools in that at-large conversation?
You know, I think it makes a lot of sense if you get the numbers to work out the right way. You don't want the tournament to be lessened in value, but if you think about it, even from our conference a couple of years ago, right? Indiana State should have made the tournament, right? And if you expand it by another 6 teams or 8 teams, right? You have the opportunity for some of those mid-majors to be able to participate. I think one of the benefits of the basketball tournament every year is to see a 15 seed or to see a 14 seed, right? Going down to the wire against a 2 or a 3 seed, right? Those 15 seeds, those 10 seeds, those 11 seeds come from our conferences, and that's the reason why the tournament is so successful.
And I want to take a moment to congratulate you. You know, it may not be a month ago, but when the United States Department of Education awarded Evansville that $30 million Promised Neighborhood grant, one of just 3 awarded in the country. It was in 2023. And how have you kind of used the funds for that to kind of lay the groundwork for what has now seen such importance in not just the sports side of your school, but just all well-roundedness as we lead into like one of the more unknown futures of NCAA?
Well, you just think about higher education, right? There's been some criticism of collegiate sports, right? And there's areas in which we can do better, but the progress has been enormous. Just think about it. 20 years ago, graduation rates were 20% less than they are right now, right? Most expensive degree is the one that you don't get. So NCAA doing extraordinarily well. Promised Neighborhood grant for the university. You know, we've got to rethink about how universities interact with their communities. We can't just be a place that offers degrees, right? We have to be connected to our community, and if we can lift up our communities, Promised Neighborhood grant is $30 million of federal funds, $32 million in matching funds, $62 million that we get to invest back in our community in Evansville. And if our community is successful, so is our university. And if our university is successful, our community continues to grow. So we get to make some choices and to make a difference in our community, whether it's through a mental health clinic or whether it's through a Promise neighborhood. There's ways that we can elevate our status, just like the NCAA can elevate the status of 550,000 student athletes that are ultimately going to be successful.
It's well said, Chris. Last couple questions are more towards that board of directors side. And with your tenure due up in August, does that create a little bit more of an aggressive approach opinion-wise for you in meetings? Does it change anything knowing that you're on the last few months of your run?
I don't think so. You know, when I joined the board 4 years ago, and I didn't know what to expect, right? In part, some of me was thinking, okay, it's going to be like a junior high dance, right? The A4 goes and stands on one side of the room, and everybody else goes and stands on the other side of the room, and that's not what happens. What happens is that we meet in the middle with a whole bunch of thoughtful people that have a conversation about what's best for student athletes, and I've been really impressed by that. I don't know if I was thinking that would happen 4 years ago, but finishing up my 4 years and 3 years as vice chair, I could say that I got a chance to meet a really number of people around the country, whether athletic directors, presidents, conference commissioners, NCAA staff, that are really committed to the right things. And sometimes it might take us a little longer to get there, but we're talking about the right things for the right reasons. And I'm encouraged about the future, whether I'm part of the board or not.
Well, I'll open it up for you here to take whatever platform you want, but let's say we chat in August. Your run comes to a close. What would you want to see either changed or added to the entire landscape between now and then?
I would love to be celebrating the SCORE Act getting passed by the House, endorsed by the Senate, and signed by the President. I think that provides some additional stability that happens in college sports. We've been getting our house in order. We need some help to be able to do the rest of it. So we don't have eligibility cases where student athletes are asking for a 7th and 8th year. We got to remember there's student athletes that are in high school that are behind them. And if we continue to grant more eligibility cases for those with beyond their traditional playing careers, it makes it that much more difficult for high school seniors to be able to become part of the basketball team at the University of Evansville, because you have student athletes that are here for an extended period of time. I'd love for us to be able to see us get eligibility in order.
Makes sense. Thanks so much for stopping by.
My pleasure. Good to be here.